No, pues muy buenos días a todas y todos. Muchas gracias por su presencia. Estamos también grabando el evento vía Zoom, con algunos participantes, vía Facebook. Estamos con la posibilidad de escuchar a la doctora Birgit Manko, que viene por otras diferentes razones. Fue invitado a un evento organizado por el doctor John Saxe Fernández, acá a un par de metros, y me pareció que es una buena oportunidad de, en fin, escuchar con base en su experiencia, sus reflexiones sobre el tema de la crítica a la economía política hoy, ¿no? ¿Por qué estudiar la crítica a la economía política hoy? ¿No? Antes de presentarla, yo simplemente destacaría que el tema, más allá de su relevancia académica, no es del todo irrelevante en la Facultad de Economía y en el posgrado de Economía de la UNAM, ¿no? Yo les recuerdo, nos comentará Bieguis al respecto, pero no existen sorprendentemente en el mundo, ¿no? Demasiadas instituciones académicas donde la crítica a la economía política siga siendo un tema obligatorio para los estudiantes. Podremos debatir sobre su actualización, sobre enfoques, sobre tiempos, sobre cursos, etcétera, etcétera. Pero concretamente en la Facultad de Economía, a nivel de licenciatura y en el posgrado de Economía, estamos en un proceso de reforma, actualización, modernización del programa de estudio. Y bueno, bienvenidos a una discusión sobre, en fin, qué tanto se quiere dosificar micro, macroeconometría, matemáticas, historia, economía política, etc. ¿No? Entonces, bueno, será un tema, me parece que significativo en esta institución, como decían por ahí, hoy, ¿no? Y bueno, comentábamos con Alejandro hace un momento, bueno, si queremos convertirnos en una institución en la licenciatura, en el posgrado, con puras micros, macros, estadística, matemáticas y econometría, vamos a ver cómo nos va en la competencia con el Harvard, el MIT y muchas otras. ¿No? Me temo que no muy bien, pero bueno, se vale contar, ¿no? Entonces, en ese contexto, yo simplemente les recuerdo la dinámica de esta sencilla conferencia. Es la presentación de la doctora Manko y comentarios por parte del doctor Alejandro Álvarez Bejarra y míos al final, ¿no? Birgit Manko fue profesora durante varias décadas en Berlín, ¿no? En la Hochschule, se llama en alemán, de Economía y Derecho de Berlín. Estudió sociología en la Universidad Libre de Berlín, trabajó antes de trabajar en Berlín, en Dortmund, en varios otros, en Darmstadt, en Alemania, ¿no? Y se ha especializado en temas de economía crítica, la economía política, las dimensiones sociales del proceso de globalización, mucho en temas y debates europeos, incluyendo instituciones de política internacional, sindicatos, entre otros. Publicó conjuntamente con su esposo Elma Altvater, uno de estos libros, del 2002, Las limitaciones de la globalización, que tuvo mucho éxito en Alemania también. Tuvieron, no sé, más de 5 ediciones en su momento y generaron toda una discusión, ¿no? Es una querida amiga, y bueno, me parece que es un lujo tenerla. Hay algunos estudiantes de maestría que han leído algunos de sus textos, ¿no? La presentación de Birgit va a ser en inglés. Ella entiende, si hablamos despacito, entiende italiano y algo de español, pero preferirá hacer su presentación en inglés. Yo creo que para algunos nos va a servir también para ver cómo anda nuestro inglés, ¿no? Entonces, en fin, sin nada más, de nuevo la dinámica es una presentación de Birgit, comentarios del doctor Alejandro Álvarez Bejarra, profesor recientemente retirado de la Facultad de Economía, con un amplio conocimiento de temas de economía internacional, de economía política, de crítica a la economía política, uno de los primeros que empezó en la Facultad de Economía a trabajar sobre temas asiáticos y del Pacífico. Recuerdo ahí algunas lecturas sin ponerle fechas, ¿no? Y entonces, bueno, después de estas diversas de esta presentación y comentarios, tendremos tiempo para interactuar con la doctora Birgit, ¿no? Entonces, bienvenida a la UNAM, a la Facultad de Economía, por favor, ¿no? We can use that. Or this.
Okay, thanks Enrique for the nice invitation. Hello to everybody. I'm very glad to speak for the third time now in a short week to students and researchers and professors from the UNAM, which I know from former visit. And well, actually, as Enrique asked me to, well, refer to this topic because he gave me this topic actually. I decided, well, to link it to something which is more in the center of my recent academic and political engagement, which is the ecological questions, because I know from my university where it's no longer possible to teach a class in political economy, which is not that unique, unfortunately. In Europe, you have it everywhere, and therefore I was very glad that you have still common understanding that the critique of political economy might be something important. And I try to link it to something which I think, well, still for economists is a very difficult idea to catch. And for this, namely the critique of the political economy referring to the actual ecological constraints of all sorts of economic activities. And I hope that you can follow me somehow. If not, well, I try to elaborate as good as I can afterwards. So let me start with some of the shortcomings of mainstream economics you might be quite familiar with, but nevertheless, I want to start with it. As an economic student or researcher or professor, you will have gained a quite positive understanding of modern industrial capitalism, I guess, and in particular on the effort of the market as its central instance. Mainstream economists derive their theories from the parable of exchange, not really from production. And this is quite important, I think so. And the assumption they derive also their main focus from the assumption that markets are the key economic institutions. I want you to, well, to consider more about an alternative view, a view of the founders of the critique of the political economy, namely Marx and a little bit also Engels, have developed further, and this will be my main focus. Well, for mainstream economists, capitalism primarily means that companies and not the state make decisions about scarce resources, as you know. They follow the conviction that politics should not intervene in the functioning of markets. Well, by this, they mean not only all types of markets for raw materials that are taken from nature and the products that are created from them, but they also refer to so-called capital markets and labor markets, which are artificially created markets, at least. Second point, it is also to considered an iron law of capitalism that the price of goods and services and the price of money, which is interest, represents a central mechanism for corporate decision-making. It is generally admitted that the allocation via markets can indeed, well, sometimes fail. For instance, when certain companies or people dominate the market at the expense of others, that is, when they exercise a monopoly or oligopoly, or when the risk of entrepreneurial transactions are so great that the entrepreneurs are not really able to take the risk. This applies, for example, for the highly dangerous waste products from nuclear power plants, which are still dangerous after 20 million years. And here, the state or the society as a whole should take care of final storage for the deadly waste and not the companies that produce it. But even if the market should fail in its allocation function, from an economic point of view, this does not justify the abolition of the market. The coordination of supply and demand solely through prices or even its strict political regulation is denied. At best, state intervention to mitigate the consequences of market failure is considered legitimate, as far as I know. Well, these days in particular, it is often said that the state is distorting market conditions and thus favoring unfair competition by intervening in market events. This is an argument that is repeatedly used in the ongoing US trade war, especially against the major challenger, China. In fact, not only in China, but all over the world, the economy is not left to market alone. But in China, the state does in fact have a very long-term plan or have very long-term plans. And unlike in the former Soviet Union, these are actually implemented and fulfilled. For example, China followed one of Adam Smith's, who was the founder of free market thought, a recommendation that according that shipbuilding, for instance, as Smith wrote, should never be left to market forces, because most of goods are transported via ships by sea, and because ships are indispensable in the event of war. However, after the Chinese state spent billions of dollars on shipbuilding and is now #1 on shipbuilding among the shipbuilding nations, while the US, in the heyday of neoliberalism in the 80s, stopped both government subsidies and ship production. Well, the head of US Marine Administration announced in March 17 this year that he would fight fire with fire and impose fees on Chinese-built ships in order to fund again subsidies for US shipbuilders, which is obviously quite ridiculous. So how we should judge these kind of actions, which actually doesn't really confirm the view that the state should play no or a very, very minor role when it comes to markets and market regulation. Well, on the basis of its long-term development plans for certain economic sectors, in particular through access to low-interest loans, China has in fact directed private investment into projects which no one would have invested from a purely market point of view, because it was foreseeable that for many years, maybe even for decades, no sufficiently high returns on investment or profit could be expected from these investments. However, subsidies for so-called national champions are always, and in many countries, regarded as necessary and legitimate economic support for the national economy, while subsidies received by companies that are considered part of a foreign national state, even though they are private companies, are denounced as market distorting behavior. Well, actually, this is quite confusing. Obviously, this is the expression of political will and not based on any iron law of the market itself. Well, to put it very shortly, the discipline of mainstream economics has provided us with a quite big number of questionable concepts and assumptions. I don't want to go through all of these, but at least I want to mention that the economic guild still clings to the absolutely stupid and false concept that are largely unimpressed by the real history of economic activity in modern industrial states. First and foremost, the very strange concept of comparative cost advantages. This concept, you all know as economic students and researchers, was invented by the early 19th century broker David Ricardo to advance and justify a free trade regime that serves the national interest of the dominant economic power of that time, which was Britain and the rising commercial and industrial class in Britain and across Britain. Well, in the US, in Germany and Asia at this time, this theory took hold only in the mid of the 20th century when the US supplanted Britain as the world's foremost industrial economy. Therefore, we should not be astonished that today, when the US, as a long-time center of modern industrial capitalism, while faced with a powerful competitor from Asia, who is able to set the new technical norms and the prices as well, which so far was a privilege of Western advanced industrialized countries, is moving back to protectionism and forgot about the strange idea of leaving everything to comparative cost advantages. But actually, for me, the most problematic concept in mainstream economic, obviously, is a concept of economic growth. Well, this concept of economic, maybe I go. This concept of economic growth, this concept of economic growth is, as you all know, in the center of mainstream economics, or to be more precise, of modern industrial capitalism, which is based on fossil fuel, which would be the more precise formulation. Since government, companies, finance, but also the consumers are fixed on growth. Growth, government plan expenditure, assuming that the economy will keep on growing, and they are not able actually to do it differently. Companies are obliged to grow in order to maximize returns to shareholders, as we all know, and we know with the financing in capitalism, the situation has been even become more severe, since financing in capitalism is functioning largely on interest-bearing money, since debt has to be repaid back with interest. So in addition to interest and a limited time, profitability demands growth, since debt increases well in 10, 20 years period. But growth is also something which is very strange, because this has to do actually with the inner development of modern industrial societies, it seems to be that growth is also something which is demanded from the consumer side. It seems to be that something like, well, social status today is no longer based on mutual recognition or other sorts of economic and social behavior among people, but that consumption as such and even higher consumption is the main instrument which is delivering social status. So we have something like, well, all the driving forces, be it government, be it companies, be it finance, be it, well, the population in its role as consumers are demanding growth as well, the driving motor for the economy. Well, we have to take, before this backdrop, we have to take something into account which will be in the center of an argumentation. Unfortunately, you cannot read the title of my slides, but it doesn't matter that much. The point is that we are living somehow in confusing times, and this time I think we should indeed go back to, well, the founder of the critique of the political economy, namely to Karl Marx. Not everything he has written is important today, but we can refer to some of its writing today, even, I guess, with much more interesting insights, because what Karl Marx described at his time only as a tendency, namely the world market. The world market didn't exist at Marx's time. It was a tendency at Marx's time. And we all know that the world market today is realized. It's a reality. But it's not only the world market, you know, in combination or as a result of establishing something like a world market, we have also today something which didn't exist so far before, namely both ecological system. And this will be the main focus in my main part. But first I want to come back on something which I mentioned in the very beginning, here referring to something Galbraith has written recently. For mainstream economics, production is not really centerpiece, it's exchange. And therefore, the assumption is that markets are the key institutions of the economy, and this enables economists to treat production somehow as an afterthought, organized in pseudo markets. So there seem to be markets for labor, markets for capital, markets for technology, and economists usually don't have any problem to refer to this. Even though, and this is something we can learn from Marx, but also from critical historians such as Karl Polanyi, that markets for labor, markets for land, and markets for money are quite new interventions. Interventions created in the 18th century with a brutal force of state power, first in Britain and later everywhere. So these kind of constellations we today call market were not the rule, never in Europe nor across the world. Karl Marx has analyzed the establishment of markets as a process of primitive accumulation, since unlike products and services, labor, land, and money are not produced for exchange. They are, in Marx's term, fishes commodities. And to treat them as if they would be commodities had disastrous consequences at his time in the in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and even today, for peasants, for workers, for nature, and in particular, the disastrous impact for nature. This will be in the center of my second part. But I want to mention also the Austrian-born economic historian. I don't know whether you know him, but I think it's still very relevant to study his wonderful books, namely Karl Polanyi, who have characterized these in his book, The Great Transformation, the, let's say, emergence, or to be more precise, the creation of markets in the 18th century as setting into motion a satanic mill. This only since then, since the 18th century, that markets, which existed obviously everywhere and for a long period of time, but not markets for labor, for land, and for money. Because these three issues or phenomenon, market, labor, land, and as well as money, they were strictly controlled in all the other cultures, and they were very limited, and they were limited usually by political communities for very certain purposes. And they were not exposed to ruinous competition at all. It was only since the simultaneously onset of the use of fossil fuel. First, it was in addition to biomass coal, then in addition to coal and biomass, it was oil and gas, and today we add also renewable energy sources to the already existing use of fossil fuel, only in combination with the use of these non-human, non-animal sorts of power, it was possible to increase the energy used per hectare of land. And this actually is the precondition for everything else, you know, for world population to grow, for economic activities to grow, for this we call wealth creation, but also for healthcare system, for education systems. The basis of this is that we can increase, with the help of fossil fuel, the productivity of 1 hectare land, which is obviously limited on planet Earth. And this is the magic formula on which the markets of nearly everything, so the commodification of land, of labor, as well as of money, have become the driving force of capitalism. So, as a first element, let me remember only with the big machinery and the big energy. Big energy means not the energy you have available in terms of human power and animal power, but with the help of fossil fuel, machinery driven by fossil fuels. Not only the systematic exploitation of labor becomes possible, but also huge advancements in labor productivity and the acceleration of all social and economic processes. And this is a period which you see here on the one graph from the very famous economic historian Agnes Madison, who did a calculation which is for the OECD in the year 2000, calculating the economic growth during the last 2000 years. So it was from 2000 going back to year one after Christ. And what you found out, well, actually there was growth in the societies in Europe and Asia and Africa, everywhere, but the growth was, economic growth was something we call the dynamic equilibrium, so always changing between plus 0.2% and minus 0.0%. So it was not that it was steady, but there was a change, but this change was quite minor. Only with industrial revolution and the use of fossil fuel, we saw this very strange new development happening. So growth beyond this 0.1%, actually to 2-3% on average in a 10 years period, adjusted for inflation. And we see what actually there is this very famous US historian, Michael Mann, has coined it the hockey stick, that this hockey stick development after the Industrial Revolution. But, you know, when you go further, you know, and add the years in the 2000s, you see that it's even go further. So with the integration of the former, with globalization in the 90s and decades following, and then with the integration of millions of additional workers from the former socialist campus, so Soviet Union as well as China being integrated in the world market, we saw even a higher curve. So in terms of unusual, absolutely unusual economic growth. And this is something I guess we have to take as a starting point, that the growth, the average growth of 2%, 3%, even on 10 years period, this is something which is very unusual, and it's nothing which can be expected to stay. So what you see here in the second graph is, in parallel to economic growth, we see for also this tremendous growth of fishery. Well, you cannot see it, you know, and there, but you know what these colored graphs, curves show you are parallel increases in fishery exploitation, ocean depletion, car production, species extinction, loss of tropical rainforests, and obviously also a lot of population growth across the world, in combination with a tremendous increase in CO2 emissions. So with the wonderful growth in parallel, we saw all the damages caused by this sort of growth. And this is the background, this is the background which will now be in the center of what I wanted to refer to, because I think still, even if you are accustomed to deal with a critique of political economy, you might not deal that much with the one finding Karl Marx thought was his really own finding. You know, so what actually I stand off the shoulders, always stand off the shoulders of other thinkers, philosophers, economists, and I develop further what they have written. But there's one thing which Marx thought was really his discovery, and he was very proud of. And I think this really is something we should understand, because it helps us to make sense of the development, the empirical development I have touched on in the slide before. Namely, what Marx calls the dual or double character of all economic processes. He thought this was his most important discovery, because with this concept, he was able to explain the systematic blindness of all economic actors towards the daily but inevitably inescapable transformation of all tangible values into intangible values, interchangeable categories such as commodity, price, money, and wage. So Marx started with the focus on what he called the use value. The use value, this is, you know, something we can easily understand. What kind of use would have for human beings? Everybody can describe it very easily. And he called this use value of something which is created by human labor, but to an even larger amount, not created by human labor, but simply, as Marx coined it, presented by nature as a free gift, which nobody owns, neither a person, nor an entire society, and even not a nation or all of us, he wrote, but it's only simply given to humanity, and humanity can benefit from it. And it has obviously to take care of it in order to benefit from these natural riches which is something else than the wealth of nation, which Adam Smith described. Adam Smith described the wealth of nation, which is created by the second element, namely by exchange value, while Marx is referring first on this use value, which cannot be created. Human can use it for its purpose, but it should also take care of it in order to have it. And these are all the natural resources we have in mind, but also the human body obviously is something we should take care for it, because it cannot be really created as an item for a market. Usually, children are created for other purposes than to produce a labor power, obviously. So we should take care of these true riches, as Marx wrote, which are the use values, referring to the physical and the material world, which I will later call the real economy, because this is on the basis of everything we are doing. Whatever we do, we need the physical and material preconditions in order to produce goods or services or whatever. However, under the condition of the capitalist formation, these use values at the same time are exchange values. So this was a discovery of Marx. You know, the same item can have a use value, so I can change some fruits into something which feed my body, but I can also use the product as something to exchange it for something else, and obviously money is a mediator to do this. And this is what Adam Smith has referred to as the wealth of nation, namely the exchange value created out of the exchange of something we coin commodity. They are made up by wage labor. They are made up with a machinery, and always bigger machinery. And today with artificial intelligence, this is still only machinery, and always on the basis of fossil fuel, because you can't do it on the basis of human energy. You need additional energy in order to run all these machineries. These exchange values are based on commodification, so you turn everything into a commodity you can exchange on markets. And as you already know today, even you can even rent a female body as a birth or motherhood machine. You know, this is something which rich people are doing, referring to poor women in India. You are using them as a machine to give birth to children, which is something actually incredible. You know, you turn a human body into something like having an exchange value and giving a price on the child you can finally receive from a woman. So actually a woman body is neither as natural resources are. They are not produced for the market, and they are turned into market items via this double mechanism of value exchange, as well as production of use values. Well, the point is then on the side of value, when you refer to the dimension of use values, we are obviously confronted with a structural dilemma. The real economy of energy and matter is unable to grow. There is no possibility to grow through trial land. You can use it and you can reproduce it if you are doing it appropriately, but you're not able to create it. You can only use it, and maybe this picture will help you to understand the main message here. It's very easy for a human being, obviously with the help of big machinery and big energy, to turn a rainforest into something like a plate where cattle can graze, and then you can use the hides of the cattle in order to produce shoes or something else, but you will never be able to return the shoes into something like the rainforest. Actually, this is the type of change which is irreversible. The use value you can consume, meaning you can destroy it, or you change it into something else, which then has a exchange value, and you can use, obviously, the soybean or the leather from these animals in order to buy something else, but you will never be able to return it into a rainforest. And the same is in the second picture might help you. It's quite easy to turn an aquarium into a fish soup, but you never be able to return a fish soup into an aquarium. This is a famous example given to you. In order to clarify, you can always return exchange value. So money you have made with the exchange of some goods into something new, a good you want to have or a service you want to have, but it's impossible to do it with regard to the basis of your exchange, namely the use value incorporated so what you have on the use value side, that's what Marx described, is a qualitative transformation. You turn something from this shape into another shape. It might be it is good for you or not. In terms of emission, it seems to be not that good for you, but there's always a qualitative transformation of matter and energy, and this is irreversible. So it's irreversible, meaning you cannot turn it back. While on the other side, referring to exchange value, you can always turn it back. And while you have more money available and you can buy more goods and services as well. And yes, economists do take in consideration that there might be crisis in this process. So we always are referring to these famous cycle of prosperity and downturn and then crisis and recovery and resulting in prosperity again. But in principle, on the exchange side of this double character Marx has discovered, it's an internal process. It can go on forever. There is no limit for exchange value processes. It's infinite self-valuation of capital. But the problem is, this process is based on the other side, so on the use values. And the use values definitely have insurmountable limits, both on the input side of the economy as well as on the output side. So input side means minerals are limited, fertile land is limited, clean water is limited, clean water in the right quantity, at the right time, at the right place is limited. So these are the limits on the input side of capitalism, as we know, and we know that we have also limitation at the output side. So that's what we usually put under the notion of emissions, or the poisoning of the oceans and the rivers and so on. So there are limits where the use value provided is no longer available. And this is actually the situation we are in. So we have limits on the input, on the use value side, but we are still in a system which behaves as if there would be no limits. And this is the problems we have to take as actually the basic issue of critical political economy, I would argue. And therefore, I think as economists, I guess you usually deal with what is yellow here, the real or the productive economy, creating industrial value through technology, innovation, efficient manufacturing, and so on. And if the yellow triangle becomes bigger, yes, that's fine. That's what everybody wants. The state, the government wants, company wants, finance wants, also the population wants to have this yellow become bigger and bigger. And we know in the meantime, while we have a next level added to it with the financialization of everything, meaning that we saw that there is something growing, despite the fact that the real economy of production is not growing at all, namely the financial sector. But I will not refer to this, what is very often called virtual wealth, but actually always connected to real debt, and therefore we know that, well, the financial system is not that much decoupled from the real economy, but when it collapses, it has feedback a mechanism on the real economy. But what economists usually don't take into account is my green basement or foundation of the economic building, namely what I call here the real economy, the economy of energy and matter, which is not really part of economic education as far as I know in a lot of university, even though all what is happening within the yellow triangle, which we usually call the real economy, is depending on this green basement. So we have in capitalism an unborn drive of valorization that erodes its own material condition. That's my main argument in this short commentary or presentation. The logic of capitalist production for exchange rather than use drives the expansion to exploit natural forces for eternity. And there's no inbuilt mechanism in capitalism where you can trust that any capitalist will stop destroying nature. This is absolutely stupid. This will never happen because on the abstract side of value creation, there is this possibility that value can grow without limits. But actually, I don't have to elaborate, I guess, intensively. We all know that we are approaching tipping points, not only of climate, we are approaching in the same amount tipping points of human development, I would say, because within the system of use values, we see limits which will have consequences for the system of exchange value. But we can already say that even before the system of exchange value is breaking down, within the society, we already see something like, well, social limits of this type of capitalism. And again, I used as a tipping point of capitalism as a title. I don't know whether you're aware of it. The notion of tipping points comes from Earth Science System, where today they identify 9 of these systems on which all life on Earth depends, and they had identified 10 years ago that 3 of the systems are beyond the limit where we can be sure that there is safe operating space for human beings as well as for animals on planet Earth. And today they identified that already 7 of these 9 Earth systems, biophysical systems on which we depend, are already crossed. So we are already near to what they call a tipping point, and the tipping point is when one of the system is collapsing. And for instance, the Arctic ice shield only needs 2 grades Celsius compared in temperature increase compared to pre-industrial level in order to collapse. And therefore all scientists are pretty sure that we, or at least you, because you are younger, much younger than I, will experience a collapse of the Arctic ice shield. And with the collapse of the Arctic ice shield, the so-called Gulf Stream as a next system will collapse. So there will be domino effects when one of the tipping point an ecological system is reached, another tipping point will be triggered and then cause damages, meaning, for instance, that the rainforest will disappear forever. So I took this notion of a tipping point into consideration in order to describe it, the situation of capitalist economy as a whole, saying that within the system of use values, we are already seeing, well, or we are very close, or may even have crossed tipping points, because the over-exploitation of terrestrial as well as maritime resources is obvious, and you have so many data which are proving this. You see also that the huge social and ecological impact of mining is crossing all dimensions. And you know for sure that with the newest tendency of having artificial intelligence and the digitalization of everything, and you know what I described in other contexts as the electrification of capitalism, we see a rollback, a going back to the first form of destruction, which was really massive in its scale, linked to modern industrial capitalism, which is mining. We are going back to dirty mining for having these wonderful new clean technologies, because these are consuming so much minerals, that's a devastating effect on the soil, on the water, on the communities is horrifying. So we see ecological impact of mining today increasing due to our move toward renewable energy, toward electrification of everything, be it mobility, be it industry, be it communication. Plus what we see on the system, on the side of the system of use value, is an overload of the carrying capacity of the planet. So its ability to somehow absorb or make irrelevant the pollutants we are producing. So yes, there are capabilities of things existing, but we have overloaded the things, and now it fires back, as we all know. Plus we see a contamination of the habitats for human being, plus for animals, and this is something which is not really taken very seriously. We have today only 80% left of the biodiversity we once had. This means that for future generations, let's say in 100 years, in 1,000 years, or in 10,000 years, there's a much more limited amount of species existence on which evolution can take place. And this is something which is really horrifying, because you don't know what will develop. But actually, what is clear, that the development in future generations, centuries, thousands, must be done on the basis of a much limited amount of species. And this is definitely something where I say, well, actually, on the system of use values, we are long beyond the point of no return. But also within the system of value creation, we all obviously have a lot of tipping points, not maybe crossed, but at least reached. And I think the concentration of capital we have today, mainly the high-tech corporations concentrating so much money as well as power, is something we not have yet experienced ever before, but also the permanent acceleration of economic processes, which was linked to this very beginning of the Industrial Revolution via artificial intelligence, and all the processes linked to it is even further accelerated. This is something which also creates problems within the system of exchange value or profits, as well as the financialization of debt, which is overloading a lot of debtors. I don't have to say this here in a country of Latin America, very often overloading debtors in its capability to serve their debts, and therefore often also making governments much more accountable to creditors and not that much to the public they should respond to. Plus, we have a link to this development, an epidemic expansion of inequality as a flip side of growing economic wealth, which is usually ignored, and therefore I think, yes, we have to take into consideration that those elements, still described in the words of Marx or the founders of the critique of political economy, have repercussion already on the societies, because the impact those developments have on agriculture, on water supply, on food and energy, which are creating a nexus, which is, you cannot grow. You need energy for food production and you need water for food production and vice versa. And this is causing a tremendous amount of interstate, but in the future, obviously also of interstate conflicts, where the middle classes are entering panic and the poor are losing out anyway. Plus, we see linked to it what we see so perfectly in Argentina or the United States, but also in Europe in the meantime, namely what I call counter-revolution, causing legitimate crisis with a new right marching nearly everywhere. And this is linked to a lot of other elements which are pointing to, yes, tipping points of social cohesion within societies, namely the fact that a lot of so-called surplus population they are pushed out of countries via migrants being pushed out, or they are pushed into prisons. So when you count the people living in prisons in the Philippines, in Brazil, or in the United States, they are already excluded from normal population. This is what I call carceral capitalism. And linked to it, we see something which really can be coined dismantling of human security and uprooting of people, which is very problematic, because it's driving conflicts within the states even before the ecological tipping points are reached. So coming to my first conclusion, political economy, which is concerted with the conditions that must be met for markets to work their magic, which is matching supply and demand through the price mechanism. This, from my point of view, definitely needs to be enlarged by a critique of political economy based on the theory of Marx, which helps us to understand that the emergence and the functioning of a capitalist market economy was and still is linked to preconditions that cannot be produced by the market itself. Nature cannot be produced by markets. It can only be preserved, it can be reproduced, it can be used up, or it can be destroyed in the process of economic exploitation, but it cannot be produced. Money, for instance, cannot be produced. Money depends on trust in social institutions, as we all know. And we can, actually, it's not that difficult to see recently how easily you can destroy trust in money. What Donald Trump does, is destroying trust in the dollar as a world currency, actually. So you cannot take it for granted that, actually, trust in dollar will remain. So therefore, we should always keep in mind these three elements, that neither labor, nor nature, nor money is something that the market can produce out of itself. It depends on social relations and on relation to nature. And thus, we need definitely, first and foremost, decent policy at national, at international level to prevent the collapse of ecosystems, but also the collapse of states, which are supposed to organize something like welfare to its citizens, or to allow a qualified workforce to be educated, because this will be the first thing which has to happen in order to have a labor force sometimes, you know. And when you deteriorate, as it's recently the case, for instance, in Europe, the educational system, actually you will not have a qualified labor force in 25 years, you know, when you would need it. So actually infrastructure, including the social infrastructures, are the basic foundation of market economies to do their magic work. Thus, I would argue, and this is a conclusion not that many people would draw, but I would do, is that some sort of planning, some sort of rationing, and some sort of high taxation of the rich is necessary in order to finance these sorts of precondition for markets to work. And this is something, well, all the people require, this is real socialism, and we can't do this. So actually, this is my last slide, conclusion number 2. So you see here again, actually, this is not really good to see. So this is again, this wonderful hockey stick. So this is from here first after Christ to year 2008 only, but it doesn't matter, the curve will be the same. So it's not that there is nothing in year, let's say 300. So there was growth of, as I said, plus 0.2% inflation adjusted, as well as down to 0.2. So it was not flat, but obviously there was this huge increase since Industrial Revolution and going further. And so what is necessary, we have to imagine, would be that this curve, you know, which is now very high, even higher than in this graph, has to go down again. You know, and when I try to illustrate it to my students in Germany, which obviously are not students living in a country which still has some development to do, but we are a highly developed industrial society. And what I tell always my students, you know, in order to imagine what the challenge would be, we have to reduce our energy use, our material use, all our use, first back to the level we had in Germany or in Europe as a whole, not in Southern Europe, but in Central Europe, in the 1970s, then go back to the 1960s. And if we would reach the level of energy consumption, water consumption, material consumption of the 1950s, yes, this then might be a constellation which might be sustainable in such a sense that with the knowledge we have acquired since then, because it's not the Middle Age. You know, it's not the Stone Age, what my students always say. Actually, I was born in the year 1950. You know, actually, it was not the same as today. But we are not living like in the Stone Age. And we have now so more knowledge available in order to use everything we already have produced in order to organize a decent life on the level of a circular economy, using everything we have as often as possible, and then reusing it and finally recycling it. This must not be a bad sort of living, but actually this means shrinking. This means going down in terms of economic growth, but actually this is structural change that would respect the social ecological constraints on human action. But the problem is this kind of dynamic equilibrium doesn't fit with modern industrial capitalism, you know. So actually, yes, what would be necessary is not possible within capitalism. And, you know, then people say, actually, so there is no solution at all. And I told you, sorry, there had been huge empires, huge civilization existing. And I don't have to tell this being in Mexico, how huge and big and influential a civilization could have been, you know. And these civilizations, they collapsed even though we have not the reference to the Aztec, but we have at least a reference to the Roman Empire, which existed for 1,000 years, you know, and you cannot imagine that modern industrial capitalism based on fossil fuel existing only since 70 years, that this system with such a short life is not able to be turned off and, you know, change into something else. Sorry, you know, bigger civilizations and industrial capitalism has collapsed, and we have to be prepared for this, that this must not be the end of all human beings, but going ahead with the system, this definitely will be the end of human life as we know it so far. So thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Birgit. So we will continue with some brief commentaries by Dr. Alejandro Álvarez de Jara. And by the way, I think we wanted to thank also Professor Sergio Martinez, Rivera Martinez, for his presence. He's the coordinator of the area of knowledge of political economy. Thank you very much, Sergio. Alejandro, please.
Sí, gracias,
Toma
Enrique.
el micrófono. Sí.
Well, let me just make a few comments because this has been a very elaborated vision of the significance of critique of political economy. I would say that it is very important to think in terms of what is going on right now within the capitalist system. It is absolutely clear that we are in the middle of a deep crisis. And to be more precise, we're just in a historical transition, moving from one way of operating the system to a different way. And with a hegemonic power being displaced and the rising of a new one and a new coalition of international forces. So this is very important to consider because the issue of ecology will be much more precise to refer as a climate change crisis, because this has been an incredible problem without significant international attention. If there is no way of having cooperation to solve, or at least to try to retain the problem, and while trying to organize the things in a different way, it is not expensive, but the rationale for approaching to this problem has become impossible, because there is a group of corporations that are always saying that we have no climate change problem. And they have been paying for studies showing that this is the natural evolution of the air. And so practically there is nothing that we can make. Well, now this is one serious problem, that the main ecological problem has not been addressed systematically and seriously at the level that we need. So the idea of Birgit going from the shortcomings of mainstream economics is very important because we are not only in the middle of a crisis of capitalism, but also in a crisis of economic theory. Because there is a lot of things that they are not explaining, and they are not giving a sufficient answer to how to handle this enormous problem. So it's even worse. They are saying that we only need to go ahead with the deregulation of the international economy. So, which it is really great. So I think that of the two basic concepts and assumptions that Birgit chose, I would say that the growth paradigm is maybe the most interesting one, because all economic theory has been founded on the idea of growth as a permanent project or permanent accumulation process. And this is also related to the problem of the tipping points, because we are living beyond our limits. And this is exactly what's going on with the US economy right now. They have been living for years beyond their limits. And now with the problem that they are making us, the rest of the world, to be responsible of their problems, which is really great. I think it's a very interesting approach to try to regain perspective on interdisciplinary studies, because the economy, the mainstream economists have been narrowing their focus, just making disciplinary interchanges with mathematics and psychology, just trying to explain behavior, but not going to the deepest earth problems. So I think that the necessity to study the critique of the political economy is to recover first history, second politics, third social impacts, and of course economic, and to try to recover an explanation of where the hell are we going to with these policies. So at the same time, it is interesting to see how, from the double character of all economic processes, Birgit has come out with not only ecology, but the state, growth, work, and most important, the notion of limits. Because this is something that has provoked a big controversy in different sciences, so that we can operate, or we are being operating as we have no limits, and that's not true. And it's going to be more evident the more we can advance in this time. The problem of interactions between the financial system, the real economy, and the physical limits are also very relevant to try to understand why we need a new approach and to study seriously the critique of the political economy. Particularly made by the Japanese, but also I think that in Germany, which is not my field of expertise, that they have been recovering studies of Marx and putting the problems of ecology in the first space. And this has provoked a lot of the new developments, particularly by the Japanese studies in political economy. And they have been trying to understand this interaction of man and nature along these years, and at the same time exploring the new ways of organizing the relations between men as economic producers. Finally, I think that this now new vision of considering transition, transformation, and adding the risk of collapse, which is a point that we are not very far from collapse, because the problem we have been only going by planning, but at the level of the corporation, but not for the rest of the economic agents or economic actors. So I think that the crisis of capitalism shows that the economic theory is suffering a deep crisis. And the emphasis that there was a professor Nobel Prize that came here and in a conference said that there was something called like a Nobel Prize route. So you want to fight for a Nobel Prize, because you need to study some issues, and that's the problem. It is not that the system is just demanding for the people who has been studying economics to show the main destabilizing processes and solution. And I think that we are just at the time when we need to reconsider this very seriously. And particularly because in the case of this faculty, now we are talking about changes in the studies plan. And there's a lot of people that thinks that we need to get out of the critique of political economy because it's so antique and unnecessary. And this is more necessary than ever. I really appreciate Brigitte for her exposition, and I hope that you can take advantage of these ideas to try to develop your own. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Some additional point, no, on a very complex, deep presentation by Birgit in this hour, no? I would like to begin where Alejandro ended, no? Yes, we have global debates, discussions, concepts, etc. But again, I would continue with Alejandro's reflection in terms of the importance of the critique of political economy, its importance in terms of methodologies of analysis, in terms of concepts, in terms of empirical findings, but the importance also to update continuously the critique of political economy. No, we cannot continue with learning by memory the capital. That would be a joke of the critique of political economy in Marx terms. No, he would be the first who would say, my friends, this is not sufficient, to put it politely. No, first, no. I think we are so relevant, of course, no discussion, but it is relevant to integrate new content, new topics, like several of the ones that Birgit has been highlighting, an increasing shift, not to forget the social issues of the critique of political economy. I'm not saying we have to forget all the debates and probably most of the capital regarding the value discussion and exchange value discussion, which is probably 90, I don't know what percent of the capital. But very clearly, if we do not have matter and energy condition and base for social action, well, what are we talking? No, we are talking about the long-term equilibrium options for rats and cucarachas, no? But not human beings, because you know what? Human beings cannot continue today. No? First, second, apparently, I think all this discussion that Birgit and the group of researchers have been highlighting for decades in terms of tipping points, social tipping points in terms of energy and matter is more relevant than ever. No, you could quantitatively discuss how close we are, but very clearly we are playing with fire, no? And in some cases, these points of no return will generate generational debate and discussions with you, with our next generations. And this today is not a topic, it's a relevant topic. Again, not in social sciences, in Harvard or wherever, in this school. At least, to put it politely, it is not a sufficiently discussed topic in social sciences and in the School of Economics of UNAM. So we have to start with this yesterday. Tomorrow is too late. No? And there we can make a difference. No? I humbly believe. I think there are a lot of coincidences regarding the presentation of Birgit in terms of debates, discussions on the state and market interventions, comparative cost advantages, the insufficiency of a growth model and paradigm, the development paradigm. No? Highlighting also this period of the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene. I always remember I was a student of Elma Altvater in the 1980s, and I have to admit that at those times I didn't understand very well the discussions. I hope I have understood it better later, but at that time I said, well, what a funny debate and discussion. We do this today with some students that are present here. The enormous relevance from a critical perspective also on Marx. No, we don't have to study Marx on memory, but the relevance of this double character of commodities and social processes, and the anarchy of these social processes of capital is fundamental. No? The abstraction process and the compression of time and space in or through money, through fictitious capital, through the credit system, through the compound interest rate, etc., is, I believe, fundamental, but not sufficient. Again, we cannot stay only reading the capital. I would finally highlight this book of the late 1990s, early 2000s on the limits of globalization, and in terms of what Alejandro highlighted, proposals and the group of proposals that Birgit and Elma made on labor as the three main policy-oriented discussions, if you want, from the critique of political economy regarding labor, no? And of course, the discussion of labor in Europe is very different than in Latin America, Asia, etc. The issue of money, capital, and the credit system, and what Birgit has been highlighting, the issue of energy, no? Different types of energies, the limitations of new forms of energy for human beings in general. For capitalism, it's not the same to use more non-fossil energy forms than fossil energy. It's not that you simply substitute them and you say, okay, we continue with business as usual. This is an abstraction, not to say an ignorance of how energy works, no? And energy in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, no? The access of low entropy energy, which is fundamental for the access for human beings, etc., etc. No? I would finally simply ask or consider for today or future discussions, no? 2 or 3 topics. No? First of all, Birgit has interestingly highlighted that, of course, in many of these old, if you want to, readings on the critique of political economy, we always highlight, yes, the Capital was written by Marx, and yes, there is Engels. No? You have highlighted several times the importance of Engels. No? It would be interesting, I know you could give probably a second or third presentation, but what do you mean by that? No, I mean, beyond, yes, they knew each other in the 1840s, and he was the rich industrialists, no, who, thanks to him, or for good or for bad for some, we wouldn't have the capital if we wouldn't have Engels, etc., etc. But why? What 2 or 3 points would you highlight in terms of all this discussion that you posed? No? Secondly, it would be interesting to, if you have time, to give some notes on the situation of the critique of political economy that you have witnessed in Germany and Europe. No? And finally, again, each of these topics might allow for an additional discussion, but I would say, what is your opinion today, 2025, of the dependency field? No? What does this mean that the growth and development paradigm does not work today? No? Countries such as China today say, my friends, we are part of the global south and we want to have the same quality of life as you do in Berlin or in Germany or in New York or in Mexico City, by the way. We want to have the same level of, and the same quality of life, no? What does this mean today? Conceptually, politically, of course, it's very easy to say, yes, I can, you cannot. Well, welcome to a tension, put it politely, no? Again, the interesting debate. Please do not try to get into each of these topics. But whatever you think is interesting, no? And maybe you can give some initial comments and then we open the round to the public. Or maybe we open it first.
Maybe open first,
Or we do
when I
it.
start talking, that might be, time is,
So what we could do in Spanish or in English, if you have some questions, reflections, critiques to the presentation of Birgit, I would say 2-3 questions, and if we have time, we do a second round. No? If you present yourself, your name, where you come from, and please questions, no presentations. No? A ver. Yes.
Le paso el micrófono.
What is? Está Carlos, y then está alguien más.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Manco. I would like to ask you.
Your name and where do you come from? Sorry.
My name is Carlos Villa. I am I'm a student of the Master in International Relations from this university, from the Faculty of the Social and Political Science. Thank you so much for your presentation. For me, it's very interesting as a politologist to know more about economic theory. My question is, considering your presentation, your studies, your background, what is your opinion about the current discussion about the future of the globalization? Thank you so much.
Yes, in la clase.
Hi, my name is Cesar Castellanos. I'm from a Master's of Economy here at UNAM. My question for Dr. Manco is, from a political economic perspective, could you tell us about the criticism of technology as a substitute for natural resources and a solution to sustainability? Because even when we tell about the limits of the world limits, the classical response is, yeah, the technology can expand those limits. How can you answer this perspective?
Okay,
Bueno,
thank you. Simon, let's start.
Hi, Ms. Birgit. My name is Eduardo. I'm a student of the economy. I'm a student of economy. So my English is not very well, but I want to try. My question is, you say we are in a problem, material, no? We are consuming more than we are, what planet can do for us. No, we are consuming more than the nature can give us. No? I think we are now in a process to change the way to do economic affairs in the energetic. If we can make the change, do you think we make the way to do economic capitalism? I must say, the concept of the capitalist, the economics is consume and consume and consume. Do you think if we can make the change, we change the capitalist way or like other way to do economy? Um, yeah. Thanks. That's all.
Look, let's see, Simone, one fourth question and then we stop. And if there are more questions, we do a second round, please.
Hello, doctors. Thank you for the conference. I'm a student master in economics of this faculty. My name is Luis. And my question is, in your perspective, doctor, what's going on with this human society? The capitalism can reconfigure it to stop this overexploit of natural resources, or they're gonna make, or there's gonna born a new society that not is the capitalism.
Okay, can you stop there?
Yeah.
You can take that microphone if you want.
Well, actually, these are all very broad topics. I leave now a little bit the street from Enrique as a for second round because I think it's broader. Actually, on the future of globalization, I gave a talk at the other building last week, referring to the change from geoeconomics, which is globalization, to geopolitics. There's a question, why is it the case that we are experiencing this process today, and what is in the center of it? Well, actually, in the center is simply the fact that until now, the advanced industrialized countries, we usually put under the notion of the West. So the US and its allies, yes, they were the ones who were setting the norms, you know? Setting the norms mean technical norms, social standards, also the norms in the international institutions and so on. And obviously, with the crisis or even the foreseeable end of the West as a dominating power, we see that others are emerging in terms of norm setters. You know, this is something, well, the Western countries can't stand. Actually, they have no chance anymore to set the norms also in the future. But this has been also during the end of globalization first phase, which was the end of the British Empire, resulted in geopolitical tensions and finally in war, you know, because an old hegemonic power, and you don't have to think only with regard to, as a US as a hegemon, you have to include the Western powers as somehow supporting the US hegemonic power. You know, when this hegemonic power is, well, in decay, and this is obviously the case, even though we don't know whether another hegemon will emerge, whether it will be multipolar world or whether it will be only a chaotic world with nobody setting norms and standards, and you know the law of the jungle will be the one which is determined by. But always in these periods, you have the same sort of tendency: protectionism, economic nationalism, which is not a bit better than these norm setting by the West, because you know the weaker economies, those countries who are not able to compete under which kind of norms ever, be it that China is setting the norm or be it that the US is setting the norm, but you have to adapt. This is not a nice situation. But the problem is today, the second phase of, well, let's say decreasing deglobalization or shrinking globalization, or however you want to coin it, happens under the condition which I described or touched at least a little bit in my presentation, namely that in compared to the situation in the 90s, where we see this enormous amount of, you know, world market extending its reach to the last corner of the planet, we have today, well, we are confronted with limits. We are confronted with a supply chains constraint, you know, we are confronted with conflicts over access to natural resources. And this brings me to the point which has been touched a little bit by Enrique, and now I try to include something with regard to the dependency theory. Yes, actually, what we see today, we can say, well, we know it, you know, most of the raw materials are concentrated in the global south, you know, and they go ahead with a strategy of selling the raw material very cheaply and importing the technology. But in a way, I think there is a shift now. I wouldn't say it's a big shift, but at least tendency. So also countries, for instance, like Indonesia, they are trying, via export controls, for instance, they are trying to control the price of nickel, which, you know, they have a monopoly on it. And so actually there are tendencies which are different to the situation of the old dependency theory, that there is now communication existing, that there are now relationships existing, while some of the relations between the former natural rich countries of the global south, which are dependent on the buyers of the resources, this is still not really a big change at all. But, you know, with China, you know, on the table, you can say, they have at least a chance to decide, which is not that much, you know, like, you know, African countries who are dependent on the export of the raw materials, they are not really in a better shape than before. But, you know, having at least two between you can decide, you know, you're in a bit better shape. So the situation would improve in case, and I hope that this could be in the future the case, that while the new hegemonic power, let's say China, is providing these countries, I think so, to a larger amount, also with technologies they can develop further by themselves in order to address problems they have, particular in their countries, you know, because what the Western imperial powers did was not delivering any sort of technical solution for something which was really relevant, let's say, for resource-rich African countries. So this was my attempt to connect it to the dependency theory. There was a second question. There's a second question. I come back. The second question from the auditorium was referring to technology as a solution. So I find it a nice bridge. So actually, yes, technology is providing us with solutions, but the problem is, and in this relation, I would go further to argue that those students, those professors, those researchers who are dealing today with a critique of political economy should also attempt to include a critique of Marx, because Marx, as well as Engels and all those who, you know, who were referring to Marx, they had a quite positive view on the role of technological progress. And one has to understand why this was the case. You know, you have to imagine the time when these people were living, you know. They were really building their hope, you know, on progress in that technological sense. And, you know, the most stupid way to do it, we then saw realized in real socialism under Lenin, you know, describing socialism, you know, describing Soviet Union as a combination of socialism and electricity, you know, the use of fossil fuel as, you know, the way out of everything. And yes, there is still under, well, leftists across the world, a very positive view, you know, that the technology will help us to find solutions for problems we have created. But the point is, if you look critically, we find always technical solutions for some problems we have created, but we are creating much more problems with the technical solution. And nuclear power is the incarnation of this kind of stupidity, but you can find it also with other technologies. So yes, one has to develop a very careful view on where technology really can help us, you know, and to assess very critically where it can support solutions, but not to use it as a solution in order to free us from decisions which are social decisions, which are political decisions, which are conflict-driven decisions, you know. And you cannot, you know, get rid of these conflicts by saying, well, the next technology will save us, and this is something which should be developed referring to all the technologies, not only to digital ones, but also to other sorts of biotechnology and stuff like this, which is now proposed as, the solution for problems we have created. So referring to the third question, well, the consumption, yes, actually, the idea that we always are adding more and more and more, so we need definitely to develop also a critique of what really well-being would mean, what kind of solution, be it from the states, be it from self-help organization, be it from trade unions or whatever kind of social movements, is necessary to create something like a good life. And a good life is something else than simply to consume more and more of the same stuff, which have only very few additional which includes only very few additional progress or help. We are in a quite horrifying dependency of this sort of consumption. But in order to stop this crazy consumption, we would need a different kind of policy. I have to make it mandatory for corporations that before their new product is allowed to enter a market, they should prove that there's an additional functional or social or whatever function which is fulfilled by the process, and not only that it looks nicer or has another color or has 2 or 3 new functions included, and that companies should be obliged to prove that their products are not environmental damaging, and that they should allowed to repair these products and so on, and we can't start with the consumers, I don't know whether these, when I was studying, this was a source of inspiration for us as students, namely a study with the title Monopoly Capitalism from Baron and Sweezy to US economists. And in this very famous study, we liked to read, because there was not that much about monopoly capitalism existing. There's one interesting, some pages were very interesting, that in order to stop these stupid production of more and more and more, where you don't see any social progress included, in this product compared to the other, what you have to do is you have to stop or at least regulate advertisement and marketing. And when I would tell this at the school where I was teaching, the Berlin School of Economics and Law, what students have there, they have no more any knowledge about production processes. No idea. That's done somewhere else, in China or in Indonesia, We don't know how a production is functioning. They have no knowledge at all. They are studying marketing, they are studying finance, and if they are women, they are studying personal management. But they have no idea about production process. And the idea of Baron and Sweezy, in order to limit these conspicuous consumption mania, that you have to regulate advertisement and marketing, well, all economists will be furious. How can you do it? Because this is something also most of the young people want to study, and want to finally end up in terms of jobs. So you have even to start much earlier, to create an understanding of what kind of economy do we really need to organize in a different way. And this brings me hopefully to there was another point that I wanted to make, and this had to do with the relationship between politics and economy. So obviously, I expect from politicians that they have some ideas about the development of the societies, and I expect from the constituency, that's a demand from the politician, something which is not only the easiest way, let's say it like this. So I take one example. I have learned that you have a wonderful new president, and so far I think I would like her policy, but before preparing for another lecture on energy policy, I read that the president now, in response to the politics of Donald Trump, said, well, actually, we have, in order to limit a little bit our dependency on the United States, we should now start to do fracking gas as well, because, you know, you have access to the same sort of geological streams as you have in Texas. So the argument was, well, in order to go ahead with our economic model, we still need cheap gas, and cheap gas, well, she expects from fracking, which is obviously not a good calculation because fracking gas is not at all cheap. But nevertheless, it's the idea, in order to have energy independence or at least sovereignty, you simply have to go ahead with doing the wrong, because she knows it quite well. As you know, and I know that fracking is not the solution at all. But you know, in order to prevent this, one first have to start, I guess, a public discussion, you know, which way to take in terms of energy. We don't have it in Germany, we don't have it in Europe. Forget about, you know, Europe as a forerunner in energy policies. This is all wording, this is all advertisement, and it has nothing to do with reality. So actually, renewable energy capacity is added in order to cover the increasing energy amount, be it in Europe or be it in other places of the world. It's not about substituting fossil fuel. You know, you can have a discussion, I guess, and one should have a discussion in all the societies for which purposes very urgent and necessary social demands we still need fossil fuels, and which are the areas and goods and services, yes, we have to shrink in order to shrink our consumption of fossil fuel. And this would be a very different sort of discussion, you know, because yes, you can demand from your political representative that they somehow follow the demand of their constituency, but also politicians have the obligation to educate the constituency and not simply follow, you know, the idea that they don't want this, so I promise them this, even though I know it's the wrong way to do so. And therefore, yes, I think in democracy, we have also to find new ways in order to, well, to educate in a way constituencies so that they know how difficult some choices are, but also to stimulate politicians to be more courageous to tell their constituency what the real trade-offs are and what the problems are, and not simply promise something, because if you don't promise it, you will not be re-elected. And this is a principle you have everywhere, and therefore it has also to do with the future of democracy and what we really want our societies to be in terms of, you know, a common understanding of the challenges of the future and how we can address it, not in conflict, but accepting that it's a hard way to follow, but we should do it with less conflict as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are pretty much on time. Maybe Alejandro, I don't know if you would like to say some brief final words. No.
It's okay.
Thank you. No, I would simply highlight that again, regarding the invitation and the provocation, why study the critique of the political economy today? Again, it is not simply saying who is in favor, who is for or against it, but that we have to integrate many of these conceptual, methodological, empirical discussions regarding energy, not as one more commodity, no? So we have bananas, energy, and telecommunication, no? It's a basis for this way of producing and consuming, of course, and implications of new forms of non-fossil energy forms, etc. We have to update the critique of political economy. No? Not more, not less. It's not copy and paste and who is for 6 courses of Marx. This is not a discussion based on what humbly Birgit is proposed. No? Thank you very much to everybody for your assistance. You will find this video and also the presentation of Birgit in the cycle of conferences of Cechimex. And thank you very much also to the area of knowledge of political economy for this event.